Welcome. Today we're going to begin our trek westwards towards Athens. And we're going to address those philosophies of life, these atheistic systems of beliefs and practices, which were all contending with one another in Athens roughly at the same time. These systems, to one extent or another, will dominate Greco and later Roman life until about the 3rd and 4th century when they begin to wane to one extent or another, depending on the favors of the day, and new systems rise up and challenge these. The point for all of these is, like we've been expecting all along, to overcome the passions. And we get to see here the diversity of thought that exists in the Greco-Roman world. Different ways of trying to overcome the passions, but yet all from a culture that tries to value the same thing. Most of us, when we're thinking about 3rd century BC Athens, are really thinking of the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. And while they are extremely important for the development of later philosophy, and in fact other philosophical systems are all in relation to them, their systems of thought were not as holistic as others were. And because they focused on metaphysics instead of on practical concerns, their ideas waned and their schools of thought were not as influential for a few centuries, really up until about the 3rd century AD. Rather, there were two other main systems that took hold in Greek and later Roman thought. One is Stoicism, which we'll talk about next time, and the other is Epicureanism, or Hedonism in its broader form, which we're going to address today. There's also issues of cynicism, which is kind of this other trend that wasn't quite as popular because it's a little bit more radical, and we'll get to that here in a week. These first two were far more popular than Plato or Aristotle because they were useful. Cynicism, again, was a shortcut to virtue, is its little tagline, but it's hard to do so. Plato and Aristotle spoke of ethics and being virtuous, but didn't adequately, to most people's understanding, explain the way to overcome the passions. Later, Stoicism also had a great champion with Marcus Aurelius in Rome, and its strength was endurance over the ills of this life. While Epicureanism has a main strength of a sort of escapist quietism, and these are going to rival and even surpass Plato and Aristotle until new philosophical systems or religious identities address these practical concerns as well. Stoicism and Epicureanism, and to a degree cynicism, are identified as philosophies of life. They concern themselves with your day-to-day life, with your concerns. The things that you're thinking about today are really what they're trying to address. All of them have a goal of freedom from disturbance and an even flow to life. This becomes their idea. They want to just flow through life evenly, not fighting against things, not being thrown one moment or the other by individual passions that can dominate you. Epicurus briefly defines philosophy as an activity which, by argument and discussion, brings about a happy life, something all of you want, a happy life. The Stoics say that they practice the art of the useful, right? You also want to have a philosophy of life that will have some practical gain and practical benefit. This included not only ethical theories, but also understanding the physical world, what criteria we should have in defining what is the truth, language, and psychology as well. The goal is to create a holistic life, not just answer one big question. In many ways, what is happening in Greece is very similar to what's happening in India at the same time. The difference is the worldview that they're operating out of. In India, we have the samsaric cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. And either you're rejecting the caste system as the instrument to getting out of that, as Jainism and Buddhism did, or you're going to try to philosophically understand it as Hinduism did in its advanced forms of Vedanta. We have a linear worldview, although cyclical in a different sort of way as well, ever repeating, etc., that exists and permeates some of the ideas in Greece. But we're not stuck in this cycle. We're trying to live this life as best as we can, not trying to end the samsaric cycle. What do you think of when you think of hedonism? What are your initial thoughts about this as a philosophical system? Probably before 30 seconds ago, when I was addressing it as a system of life, your thoughts of hedonism probably go to notions of food and gluttony, of overindulgence. Some of you might think of it as sex or physical-based pleasure. Or, your thoughts go back to cartoon depictions of the hedonism bot from Futurama. Some of you may also think of hedonists as those atheists who just take whatever they want and don't care about others or the consequences. And these thoughts do exist to some extent within hedonism. It does speak about food. It does speak about pleasure, physical and otherwise. It does talk about you, but this isn't really the aim of what hedonism philosophically is. Similarly, if you think at all about Epicureanism, your thought is also probably along those earlier lines of hedonism. You might think of sex, fancy, exotic foods, or notions of luxury, all of which have kind of borrowed the Epicurean title for themselves of saying it's the finer things, and it's all indulgence in only what the best or the most luxurious would have. And again, this isn't exactly accurate. This isn't what the system is trying to address. Hedonism really had a bad public relations officer, and this bad public relations officer goes by the name of Stoics. The Stoics saw Epicurus and hedonism as its main philosophical rivals, so accounts were created to make it look bad, to make Stoicism look better. Not that uncommon to do if you have two rival companies trying to sell the same product, right? Epicurus was called a foul-mouthed bastard by Epictetus, one of the main leaders of Stoicism. In the Amenities, a book by Metrodorus, Epicurus was said to vomit twice a day because of his high living, right? That he's eating so much and so much rich food that he's vomiting it all up twice a day. And that he would spend all day and night philosophizing. A fancy word here to try to say that he's not doing anything or anything productive. It was also said that he was unable to get out of his chair for years, and that he was weak and unable to do any work. Forgeries were written under his name to discredit him centuries after his death. Definitions of hedonism are kind of a little bit of a mix, right? Hedonism is defined as the pursuit of pleasure, sensual self-indulgence, which is going to take on very much this Stoic idea. The ethical theory that pleasure is the sense of satisfaction of desires is the highest good and proper aim of human life. Again, this is maybe a little more accurate, but it's not exactly the fullest of the idea. And in fact, the term hedonism comes from the Greek word for pleasure. An epicure is one with sensitive and discriminating tastes, especially in food or wine, fond of or adapted to luxury or indulgence and sense pleasures, devoted to worldly or frivolous enjoyment, devoted to sensual pleasure. A person who lives life in the constant pursuit of great food, drink, debauchery, and, quote, open-minded adventure. These are different definitions you're going to find all over the place. But again, this doesn't really address philosophically the movement of Epicureanism or hedonism. These make it look far more base than what Epicurus and early hedonists and Epicureans would have actually done. If we want to understand Epicurean, the philosophical movement, we really need to understand Epicurus, the man. He was born in 341 BC, 7 years after Plato's death, and will die in 270 BC in Athens. His family were Athenians, but he was likely born in Samos, a Athenian colony, only able to return to Athens after Alexander the Great died and Perdiccas expelled the Athenians from Samos. At this point, Epicurus was probably around the 18 years of age. He'll begin studying philosophy around the age of 14, largely because he was contemptuous of his teacher's poor ability to interpret texts. He was wiser than his teachers, or at least he thought he was at this time. At the age of 32, he will found his first school of philosophy in Mytilene and Lampicus. About 5 years later, he'll move to Athens and gather followers there until his death at the age of 72. He'll die of kidney stones, and the story goes that he gathered his friends around, drank some strong wine in a warm bath, and died after excruciating pain for about 2 weeks. Kidney stones is a very painful ailment, and when it passes, it could feel good, but sometimes it doesn't always pass and can result in death. Reading between the lines about him drinking strong wine and dying in a warm bath, we'll probably want to read that he took his own life, that he opened a vein in that bath and would bleed out in that bath, as that would help him to die soon and quick and relatively painless. Although that's not confirmed, reading between the lines, that's likely what happened. Epicurus, as the man, was known for his unparalleled benevolence towards all. He was honored with bronze statues and said to have had so many friends that the city could not contain them. So he was a well-liked individual, known for the kindness towards his brothers and the house slaves, who he even taught philosophy to. Now today we would see the idea of having slaves to generally be a morally repugnant idea, but that wasn't the case during Epicurus' life, and the fact that he taught philosophy to them meant that he saw them as closer to being equals than many of the others would have in his time. He was also described as rather pious and patriotic, though he did not engage in politics, and as a distrust of politics, he tried to avoid notions of division, which he saw as inherent in any political endeavor. The same reason why he opposed putting his money in a common account with his friends as Pythagoras and other philosophers did, because he believed that it would cause envy and mistrust and ruin relationships and friendships. He also didn't travel much beyond his early days of life. Once he settled in Athens and had his school opened up, he pretty much stayed there. The school in Athens grew out of his estate, which was outside of the city walls and was known as the Garden, because it met in his garden. Go figure, right? He spent most of his time in his garden eating a modest amount of plain food, drinking a half a pint of cheap wine and water. And his luxury that he would occasionally indulge in was a small pot of cheese. So this is far from the basic idea that we think of initially with Epicureanism of fancy food, fancy drink, and luxurious items. If most of the time he's drinking cheap wine, eating bread, and occasionally indulging in some cheese. Right? This is not lining up with some earlier impressions that you guys might originally have about what you would expect out of Epicureanism. The movement which will grow out of Epicurus starts with a very simple question. Do you want to be happy? Do you? This is actually a fairly serious question, although most of us will just reflexively say, yeah, duh. Well, if you do want to indeed be happy, what's standing in your way? What obstacles exist between you and being happy? Your happiness is entirely up to you. The fundamental obstacle to your happiness is your own anxiety, your own pushing back, your own self. If you're anxious over your health, you'll get sick. If you're anxious over your food, you will not be satisfied. If you're anxious over the next life, you're not going to live this one. The key to be happy are the four truths of Epicureanism, or the four-part cure, as it is known. The four-part cure are, at least in parts, things that you may accept today. The first of which is that there's no divine beings which threaten us. Now, this is one that you may accept or you may reject, but this is the first step in understanding Epicureanism. Is essentially your life is your own. You're not in some sort of elaborate divine illusion. The second is kind of a continuation, that there is no next life. Or, broader speaking, if there is, you don't know anything about it. So why bother stressing about it? If you don't know about the next life, Epicurus and others will say, then why are you concerning yourself with what's going to happen next? Can you concern yourself with what's going to happen now? The third point is that what you actually need is easy to get. What do you actually need? What do you actually need? That list is fairly short. Food, not luxurious food, just basic food. You don't need lobster and a T-bone steak. You need water. You don't need fancy wine and champagne. Right? Just basic food, basic drink. You need shelter. How much shelter? Not much. 500 square feet is probably sufficient. You don't need a 4,000 square foot McMansion. Right? You need basic shelter. Some of you might have larger families and maybe need a little bit more space, but how much do you need? Versus how much would you like or want? Most of us say, well, I need more space because I got all my stuff. Where's all my stuff going to go? I need a bigger house. Well, do you need all that stuff? Probably not. You like that stuff, but you don't need it. And so that's part of the thoughts. You need to figure out how little you actually need and enjoy possessing that, knowing you will continue to possess it. Epicurus will also die of kidney failure and was in great pain. And this kind of leads us to that fourth point of the movement, is that what makes us suffer is easy to put up with. What's interesting is, right, he dies of great pain, but yet part of his movement is that what makes us suffer is easy to put up with. And he would continue this even during his death, which may have been, again, at his own hand, right? Death doesn't need to be worried about. While pain exists, you can choose to endure it or focus on what you have. He focused on his friends during this time of suffering, and therefore he can endure his suffering because he had his friends with him. Death is a big obstacle for most of us. It's something that we think about, or at least something we think we should think about. Right? Epicurus says that you do not need to be worried about it. In fact, there's a statement for Epicureans that death is nothing to us. Death is nothing. This was often put on rings and on mirrors to encourage his followers not to worry about death. While you are alive, you're not dead. And when you're dead, you'll deal with what it is to be dead then. Therefore, there's no reason for you to concern yourself about being dead. And since most of us worry about the next life, to simply say death is nothing. Even though Epicurus was familiar with death, it was all around him. This wasn't as hidden as it is in the modern era, right? Most of you haven't been to that many funerals, if any. And if you've been to them, not all of you have had open caskets. Not all of you have touched the body of the person who's there and dead. You haven't seen death. You hear about death. Now, some of you, this doesn't apply to. But for our culture, we don't know death. We don't see death. Our food comes from the supermarket, not from the feedlots. We don't see the death of the food that we eat. We don't see the death of the friends that we have. Again, some of us do, but most of us don't. As a culture, we pretend death doesn't exist, but then death becomes everything. We're overly concerned about an illness we could catch that could kill us, or we're overly concerned with an idea that we are mortal, that we construct large systems to pretend that it's not the case. Increasingly, we might not even be religious to think about what's the next life, because we don't want to think about death. And yet, there are those who argue that we're a culture of death on top of that, so oddly, kind of a mix of both. We thrive on it and yet are fearful of it and also completely ignorant of it. But for Epicurus and the Greeks and later Romans who are adopting his system, they're very familiar with death. They saw death. They held the bodies of loved ones who died. They know death could come around at any moment and get them. Right? Pre-antibiotics, etc. Right? Oops, sorry, you got an infection. You're dead. So the idea is, yeah, you might die at any moment, but death is nothing. What do you need? You need to live this life. Your sufferings are easy to put up with. There's not some grand cosmic scheme to ruin you and destroy you. In his letter to Menocus, we read, "Let no one be slow to seek wisdom when he is young, nor weary in the search thereof when he is grown old." So the very first thing that we need to know is that we need wisdom. That we are to be lovers of wisdom. We are to be philosophers. For no age is too early or too late for the health of the soul. Right? Wisdom is what's going to give your soul health. You need to seek wisdom. And to say that the season for studying philosophy has not yet come, or that it is past and gone, is like saying that the season for happiness is not yet, or that it is now no more. Therefore, both old and young ought to seek wisdom. The former, in order that, as age has come over him, he may be young in good things because of the grace of what has been, and the later, in order that while he is young, he may at the same time be old, because he has no fear of the things which are to come. So we must exercise ourselves in the things which bring happiness, since, if that be present, we have everything, and if that is absent, that our actions are directed towards attaining it. So we need to start by being wise. This is going to be the health for our soul. The aim of the letter is to address health of the soul and its connection to wisdom. The health of the soul is equated with things that bring happiness. So really what we want is happiness. The health is acquired first through seeking wisdom or seeking philosophy. So we first need to become philosophers. Once again, what is philosophy? Philosophy is broken out with two words, philo and sophy. There's a division here, right? Before we can understand really what he's asking about, we need to understand this term. Sophy is wisdom. Philo, or philos, is one of those words for love. It's a brotherly love. Unlike eros, which is what can I get, and agape, what can I give, Philos is a mutual relation. I give and I get. It's a middle term for love. And so this is what we need for philosophy. We want to give to philosophy, give to wisdom, and we get from it. We get from wisdom. We gain. We contribute and we gain in this same action. There are four basic teachings out of Epicurus which we can address today. The first is going to address the issue of God. For Epicurus, God or the gods is a self-evident truth, but yet it doesn't apply. Right? So we're going to agree, okay, there is indeed gods. He's not an atheist in that he denies the existence of God, but this system isn't dependent upon God or even connected to the notion of gods at all. He says that gods, by definition, are immortal and happy. But what does that mean? If most of us might even agree with this basic definition of God as a living being who's immortal and happy, but this doesn't mean what you might think that it means. It's not what you think. If there's a God who's immortal, that may or may not affect us. But the fact that God is happy means that God doesn't care about you. At least this is the argument that's being made here by Epicurus and others. Why would God be concerned about you if God is happy? You're miserable. Your life is miserable. You have pains. And therefore, the God can't be happy if indeed the God is concerned with every mortal being who suffers in this life. Therefore, for the God to be happy, the God has to be detached. God has to not care about humanity. Now notice this is very different than the idea of God being loving. We're not saying God is loving. In fact, many of you might say, but God cares for me. Well, if God's loving, then God can't always be happy. God has to occasionally weep. So you might disagree on this, but this is his basic understanding, is that the immortal God is happy and therefore isn't concerned with mortal men, which may help you out in some ways because God isn't going to care about you one way or the other. The gods are not going to curse you. They're not going to seek your destruction or your death or your ruin. Right? That's why there's no divine being that threatens us. That's why we get that first of those four truths, because the gods, well, they don't care about you. How could they? They're being happy, and you're not. The second teaching is on death. He states, accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us. For good and evil implies awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. Therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not by adding to life an unlimited time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. We need to live our lives seeking not just to prolong life, but to enjoy the time that we have. We don't want just a long quantity of life, but a large quality of life. You want your life to have meaning, or at least to be enjoyable. Death also now puts you on the clock. The power of death is that your decisions right now are important. But if you lived on forever, your decisions don't really matter because you can get to it later. Do you do this or you do that? Well, you can do it again later. The fact you're going to die means you need to do it now. Would your life have real value if you lived forever? The fact that you're going to die makes every moment matter, makes every decision matter, because it's limited in scope. The next thing that concerns most of us is the future, and so this is what the third teaching is addressing. He states that we must remember that the future is neither wholly ours nor wholly not ours. So that way we must neither count upon it as quite certain to come, nor despair of it as quite certain not to come. Right? Nothing in life is guaranteed. None of the future of life is guaranteed. You don't get to determine what will come or what you will have. You have a part in the future, and you belong to it, but it's not yours, and it's not yours either. And so, again, are we going to let our anxiety over the future mean we're not living in the present? Doesn't mean don't make plans, don't prepare, but don't worry and fret so much for what will that do to you. The root of these concerns, be it the future or death, or even the issue of God and what the gods care about, really comes down to a question of desires. And this is where he points his attention in the fourth teaching. Right? What is it that you desire? What is it that we should desire? Some things you want in life, but you have no reason to. What you really desire is happiness. What happiness really is, according to Epicurus, is freedom from pain and fear. This tranquility is both of the mind and of the body. If you want to avoid pain and fear, don't want things that either possessing could cause pain or fear, or lacking them because you want them will cause you pain and fear. Therefore, it would be best to not have them so you don't worry about the loss of them. But yet, many of us still want these things. Our desires are at odds with themselves. For Epicurus, pleasure is the alpha and omega of a happy life. When we are pained, pleasure then, and then only, do we feel the need for pleasure. For this reason, we call pleasure the alpha and omega of a happy life. Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and every aversion. And to it we come back inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which we judge of every good thing. And since pleasure is our first and native good, for that reason we do not choose every pleasure whatever, but often pass over many pleasures with greater annoyance ensures from them. Right? We don't take every sort of pleasure because not every pleasure is really going to be pleasurable for you. You know that to live a pleasurable life, sometimes you have to say no to one and yes to another. You have to make choices. But it doesn't mean that that other thing is bad. It just means that it is not the best good. And so part of what we need to do to try to make sure we have a happy life is to know what's going to be the most pleasurable. So do you drink the expensive wine? It's good, but will that ruin your taste for basic cheap wine? Maybe. Can you always afford the good wine? If not, maybe it's better to never drink it to begin with. At least this was part of what Epicurus was advocating for with his diet of cheap wine and basic bread. He was content. He was happy. He didn't think, oh, this is horrible. He thought, this is pleasurable. This is making my life happy. This is what things are. So what pleasures matter in life? Physical? That's an easy place to start. Things feel good. It's pleasurable. Therefore, that's good. Pain, physical pain, feels bad. Therefore, to avoid. So maybe we would start there. Some of us might add emotional pleasures. I'm happy. I like this. I'm sad. I don't. Spiritual, for some, this is more important than the others. You're willing to forego physical pleasure or even emotional pleasure sometimes for a spiritual gain or spiritual reward. Psychological is also part of all of that, right? Making sure that your mind works and that you're content in your own mind. And maybe that's a part of both emotional, physical, and spiritual. Maybe it's a combination of all of these lead to a contented psychological well-being. But if it's psychological is the most important, as Freud and others would argue, does it matter if it's real or imagined experiences? Can it all be pretend? Can you be happy, pleasurable with fake experiences? Does it matter if someone tells you a great story about something that happened to them but it never did? Or is it okay to tell those stories? What do we do with things like the news anchor, Brian Williams, who tells us that during the 2003 Iraq invasion, that there were rounds coming into the airframe of his Chinook helicopter, and he was forced down traveling while the invasion was going after it was hit by an RPG. None of that happened. It's all fake. He's telling these stories maybe for his own psychological need, but is that good for you? Are all pleasures equal? Is it okay if your pleasures detract from somebody else's? Should we rank physical pleasure as something high or low? Why? Why would one matter more or less than the other? Are short-term pleasures more beneficial than long ones? Does immediate gratification pay off? If it's spiritual pleasures that we want, is it more important that things happen immediately or not? Is it worth some pain of doing something to help some other spiritual or emotional or physical or even psychological benefit? Not all pains are equal, neither are all pleasures. There are some pleasures that only can exist because of pain, and some pleasures that only lead to pain. They're not all equal, and while pleasure might be seen as good to us, not all pleasure is worthy of choice and doing. Just as not all pain is an evil that needs to be eliminated and shunned. You can probably think of some bad pleasures, some guilty pleasures, some things that you do that are not good for you. And it doesn't lead to further pleasure. It usually only leads to pain, discomfort, irritability, something. And maybe it causes distrust in your emotional well-being or psychological well-being or spiritual or physical because you indulged in one pleasure over another. Similarly, there are good pains. Saying no to a bad event, a bad thing, is a pain because it might have seemed like fun, but you're saying no to it. Or the pain of lifting weights afterwards, right? That you are a little sore, but you know it's a good pain because your body is gaining strength. There's value in that. We can't always see pain as equal to evil and pleasure is always good, even as an Epicurean who sees pleasure as the alpha and omega of life, because not all pains are equal, neither are all pleasures. That we have to measure one against the other, and that's how we need to judge these. Which one leads to more and which one leads to less. So it's not just the momentary indulgence, and that's why the classical ease of approach towards hedonism, the view that Stoics and others will put on it, doesn't fit within the broader philosophical system because it doesn't actually work that way. Everything becomes a little more difficult if we're actually going to be a serious philosophical Epicurean, because we realize that pain and pleasure is not always intrinsic into the item that it is. It's not one thing automatically leads to this, that there's a lot more nuance involved. You see, it's that pain flare gives as much pleasure to a costly diet when the pain of want has been removed, while bread and water confer the highest possible pleasure when they are brought about to hungry lips. If you're truly thirsty or truly hungry, a little bit of food and water, just basic bread and water, is the greatest thing ever. While if you're full and well fed, food, well, no, that's not fancy enough. I want something nicer, right? The amount of pleasure you get out of the same piece of bread differs depending on your condition. Pain can also make way to pleasure when the pain stops. Removing a heavy weight that one feels light and free, though they are normal, if not worse off than they were before the weight was being added. If you've got this giant weight on your shoulders, literally or metaphysically or whatever, that gets removed, it feels better. You might actually be worse than you were to begin with, but you feel great because that's off. Little bits of pleasure can be done just by removing the object that was causing pain. Does that mean that there's pleasure inherent in that? No, it's situational. It's based upon you and your needs and what you actually need and what's actually going to help you thrive. So what does this all mean? Where are we supposed to go with that? When we say that pleasure is, in the end, the aim, we do not mean pleasures of the prodigal or pleasures of sensuality, as we understood as they do for some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. What we mean by pleasure is absence of the body and trouble in the soul. It is not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and merrymaking, not sexual love, not the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table which produce a pleasant life. This is not what we're looking after. We need pleasures that are going to remove pains, present and in the future. We need to find pleasures that don't disturb our soul. We need pleasures that are not derived from addiction, where you have to have it. But what if the only cost of adding to it is that you're addicted to what you like? Is that okay? Like coffee and caffeine? Generally speaking, they say the only real negative effect of caffeine is that your body wants caffeine. So as long as you get it, you're okay. In fact, there's benefits to that other end. So how's that going to work, right? Lots and lots of studies out there, but that's generally the result of that, right? You drink as much coffee as you want, as long as it's not too much. All you're really going to want is more coffee. What about habits? Are habits good? Are they beneficial? What about the runner or the gym rat? Right? If you miss a day of running or lifting, you feel uncomfortable with yourself. Are these okay? It's strengthening your body in one way or the other. It's making you feel better overall, so it's got real value. But is this pleasurable then in this way? Maybe. You got to kind of evaluate some of this on your own. How do you know which pleasures disturb your soul and which ones are actually beneficial? The answer to this is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, banishing those beliefs which the greatest disturbances take possession of our soul. We need sober reasoning. So what do we do with that? Prudence, he says, is more precious thing than all of the other virtues. A life of pleasure which is not also a life of prudence, honor, and justice will not lead to pleasure, honor, nor justice. We need to be prudent with our choices. We need to weigh them out, which takes, again, loving wisdom. You need to know which one is there. Now, the aim isn't just to be wise. The aim is to have a happy life, to be pleasurable. But you need to know through wisdom which actions are prudent and which ones are going to actually benefit you and your soul. So in summary, who then is superior in your judgment to such a person, he asks. He holds holy belief concerning the gods and is altogether free from the fear of death. He has diligently considered the end fixed by nature, and understands how easily the limit of good things can be reached and attained, and how either the duration or the intensity of evils is but slight. Exercise yourself in these and kindred precepts day and night, both by yourself and with him who is like you, then never either in waking or in dream will you be disturbed, but will live as a god amongst the people. If you find this balance, then your life flourishes, is what Epicurus says. Then, what Aristotle asks for this notion of eudaimonia is achieved. And it's known because you're happy. And happiness becomes the chief goal. Pleasure, where you're free from fear of death or want, because you don't want. It's almost notions of detachment, like we talk about within Buddhism, but it's not detachment. It's seeking pleasures. It's being attached to pleasures, but knowing which objects are really pleasurable, not simply avoiding all of them. It's in his principal doctrine, so we got many of the teachings expanded upon that we've already addressed. There's a list of sayings that kind of help us understand his philosophy to a greater extent, and so we can at least touch on some of these from this work, right? We've already addressed the issue that a happy and eternal being has no trouble within himself and brings no trouble upon any other being. Hence, he is exempt from movements of anger and partiality, for every such movement would imply weakness, right? That the gods don't care about you because then they can't be happy. What's interesting is not just that as his concern, but he also shows that this would be a notion that would imply weakness. That anger and partiality means that you're less perfect. If you love something, is that weak? Because you're partial towards it. It can be used against you. Maybe it's a form of weakness, and maybe that means you're less powerful. And yet, if you're all powerful, how does that work? Right? Are you moved by others and not determining what you want to do? Next, of course, is that death is nothing to us, which we've talked about several times already. The continuous pain does not last long in the body. On the contrary, pain, if extreme, is present a short time. This isn't always the case, but usually is. Usually if it's so extreme and it's lasting, you pass out. Right? Your body says, I'm out, I can't do this. Right? But again, this is the idea that even pain itself is not something that's so horrible. If it is impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely and well and justly, and it is impossible to live wisely and well and justly without living pleasantly, right? That we have to have, for a pleasant life, a life with some wisdom. And it has to continue to go well. So we need wisdom attached with this. Epicurus turns his attention here to goods. And he says that in order to obtain security from other people, any means whatever of procuring this is a natural good. You need not to be indebted to anybody. You don't need to need people. Some keys of happiness is to have less attachments to other people and not be indebted to them in any way. Because if you're indebted to them, then they own at least a part of you, your concerns, your mind, and maybe your soul, depending on how one would like to look at it. Continuing, he says, some people have sought to become famous and renowned, thinking that this will make them secure against their fellow human beings. If everyone knows who I am, they can't kill me. There's an element of truth to this. Sometimes your fame does put other people in a different sort of predicament. Soviet Union would have loved to just kill Solzhenitsyn, but his work had gained enough renown that it would have looked bad if they did it, so instead they just exiled him. So there's some idea of this, but seeking fame is not a good idea. If, however, it was insecure, They have not attained the end, he says, by which nature's own prompting they originally sought. You need to be aware of trying to seek fame for any purpose. There would be no advantage also in providing security against our fellow human beings, so long as we are alarmed by the occurrences over our heads or beneath the earth, or in general by whatever happens in the boundless universe. All around us, we can see different events happening. You might be perfectly secure, but the rest of the world can crash down upon you in any moment. That you're not really secure. The most genuine form of security is a quiet and private life withdrawn from the multitude, is what Epicurus advocates. The just person enjoys the greatest peace of mind, while the unjust is full of the utmost disquietude. There are real joys in just being happy with yourself, and this is what we should be aiming for. Fortune itself seldom interferes with the wise person. The greatest and highest interests have been, are, and will be directed by reason throughout the course of his life. Wealth is fine. If you have the choice of having money and not, I'd take the money. But seeking it to try to make you wise isn't going to work. It's a tool. It is not an end. Don't seek it to the loss of others, including wisdom. Of our desires, he says, some are natural and necessary, others are natural but not necessary, and others again are neither natural nor necessary, but are due to an illusionary opinion. We think that we like it. We think that we should have, that it's an illusion, though. It's not real. It's not how we should advance ourselves in our life. There never was an absolute justice, he points out. There's no absolute everything is there, but only an agreement made in reciprocal association in whatever localities now and again, from time to time, providing against the infliction of suffering harm. Don't think, oh, well, this is going to be some sort of absolute justice. This moment, things are going to come in. I need to take this thing and run with that. This should be my desire. That's not going to do you any good. Nor can we continue to look for justice to solve everything. That, too, is false. Injustice, he says, is not itself an evil, but only in its consequence, the terror which is excited by apprehension that those appointed to punish such offenses will discover the injustice. Justice is a desire of ours, but it also is made to serve us and convince for us. If you long for it, if you're only going to be happy when justice is done, you'll never be just. This is not going to happen. So you need to abandon this as an idea. One of the greatest challenges to Epicureanism and hedonism in general, in any form, is what's known as the experience machine problem. Essentially, the question is this. If you can enter into a machine for the rest of your life, not just for a moment, and have all of the most pleasurable experiences, and it seems real at that time, how many of you would do it? If it's what pleasures and experiences matter, does it matter if they are real or imagined experiences? Does it matter if someone tells you a great story but it never happened? Why? If you enjoyed the story, why does it matter if it's true or not? Does something being true add some sort of other value? And if it does, what does this mean about the system of hedonism? The question of pleasures. Why does it matter if it's a lie? Why do you want, quote, real pleasure and not imagined pleasure? Or are you perfectly content with imagined pleasure? How many of you would be like, throw me in that machine. I get to have everything and I never have to suffer or be in want. I get all of my desires, and yet maybe there's a struggle just enough to make it seem real and worthwhile. They're grounded in something genuine beyond ourselves. That sounds great, right? So looking at this, of trying to understand something that might be more real, a sort of solution could emerge that might lead us towards other forms of hedonism and not just classical hedonism. There can be a sort of theistic hedonism. This looks at hedonism from a slightly different perspective, but is completely in line with other forms of hedonism. And we can kind of see this through Thomas Aquinas. There's an idea that happiness is only really found in God, and therefore we're seeking after happiness. It's just not the pleasures of this world that cause it. It's something bigger and grander. And the same reason why Epicurus would tell you not to indulge and overindulge with fish, right? We have this same sort of argument that can be made about other temptations as far as how Aquinas would see it. To know what Aquinas thinks or says about something, the best place to always go is the Summa. And so here he's asking the question about man's last end. What are the ends? What is it, the things that we are directed to? Whether it belongs to man to act for an end at all, for us to be pointed in a certain direction. He says, all things contained in a genus are derived from the principle of that genus. Now, the end and principle in human operations, as the philosopher, by the way, if you haven't already picked up on this, anytime the philosopher is mentioned, that's Aristotle, states, therefore it belongs to man to do everything for an end. Right? Following Aristotle, we have certain ends to which our life is directed for. Right? This is for Aristotle when we were trying to get eudaimonia, this notion of happiness. And Aquinas is building on that and growing in that. I answer that of all actions done by man, those alone are properly called human, which are proper to man as man. Now man differs from irrational animals in this, that he is the master of his own actions. Right? There is a difference between a human will and the will of a dog. What the dog wants and what a man wants are different. Our wills are different. How we're going to move and operate are different. How we're designed, bred, whatever term we'd like to use, is different. The free will is defined as the faculty and will of reason. Therefore, those actions are properly called human, which proceed from a deliberate will. But the object of the will is the end and the good. Therefore, all human actions must be for an end. This is his answer. We all have an end. We're all directing ourselves to this point, to our major end. He then goes on into Article 4 and says that there is necessary to fix one last end, one thing which we are going after, right? And we have a very similar argument that's made by Aristotle in his pursuit of eudaimonia, right? What are proximate ends and what are final ends? There is a difference here because he says, since the first good diffuses itself according to the intellect, which it is proper to flow forth into the effects according to certain fixed form, it follows that there is certain measure to the flow of good things from the first good, from which all other goods share their power of diffusion. So he points out here that all of our goods come from the prime good, the first good. If we want to look at things through a Neoplatonic universe, then we would say ultimately from the one. If we're going to follow a theistic conception of the universe, as was the case for Aquinas and others, the virtues all flow from the God. Therefore, this is where goodness comes from. All goodness comes from God, and therefore, when we see something as good, it's as it relates to God, and our directions move that way. Continuing in Article 6, he says that man must necessarily desire all, whoever he desires, for the last end, right? All of our real desires are for this last end. And since our last end has its source in that first good, in God, then all of our ends are really found back in God. Therefore, this theistic hedonism is you're only going to be happy if you're doing the goods, and the only real goods that matter are those spiritual goods that relate back to God. All temporal goods are only good in relation to how they serve this ultimate good. In Article 8, he says, I answer that as the philosopher, as Aristotle says, the end is twofold, the end for which and the end by which the thing itself, in which is found the aspect of good, and the use or acquisition of that thing. Right? Some things are good on their own, and some things are good to serve this larger goal. And all of the goods in this life are truly good in how they relate to the ultimate goal of serving God. If therefore we speak of man's last end as the thing which he is the end, thus all other things concur in man's last end, since God is the last end of man and of all other things. Hence it is evident how the objections are solved, since happiness means the acquisition of this last end. Real happiness is only getting to that source of the first happiness, and thus is the real and ultimate good. So at the end of this discussion of hedonism and Epicurus, we have to ask ourselves, what is the source of true happiness? Where does it come from? Is it God, as Aquinas argues? Is it to have minimum pain? Just pains absent of the body, of pain and trouble of the soul? Is it just base pleasures? Is the character of hedonism correct, and that's just, ooh, that feels good at the moment, I'm going to do it? Is it something else? Is it a combination of these in a certain measure? These are the questions we're left with. So what has this ethical system told us about what is ethical? Is ethics based upon, does it bring more pleasure and pain? Are we going to go become utilitarians with this? What's going to constitute our good life? How should we see it? What's the scope of it? How should we address that? What are the passions? What are the advantages or disadvantages therein? And how should we overcome them? And maybe even ask questions about why we should overcome them, introducing this as a concept within our discussion as well. Is Epicureanism a religion or not? Does it lack the basic qualities of how you would define a religion? Or is it essentially just a religious system like many others? And how can this help answer the big questions that we have today? Is it interested in those or not?